This is Money Mindful by Hansi Mehrotra on CampusGal.
Hey CampusGal! What if I told you that you don't have to sacrifice having a good time in order to save some money? Because, let's be real, you deserve to be living your best life without the money stress. So stay tuned to Money Mindful, where we give you some sure-shot strategies to build some healthy savings habits, crush your finance goals, and still have a ton of fun along the way, because YOLO.
In the episode on risks, we talked about risks that are inherent in the investments we make. These are external to us. Today, we'll talk about risks that are internal to us. These are risks, or these are ways in which we behave and respond to external risks in terms of how we view the world, how we view volatility and loss and not being able to meet our goals. This is what the industry calls risk profiling. Hi, I'm Hansi, and in this series, we are learning to be money mindful. So what is a risk profile? Well, when you go to a financial intermediary, whether it's a mutual fund or a financial advisor, wealth manager, relationship manager, or even an online tool provider, everyone will give you a questionnaire, and they call it the risk profiler. Now, that questionnaire will have anywhere between 5 and 50 questions, and it will claim that it's trying to measure actually a range of things. Some call it risk aversion, risk preferences, risk capacity, risk tolerance, risk composure, risk perception. So all kinds of things. So confusing, right? Yes, even the industry is confused. But globally, there is some agreement between academia, regulators, and the industry that actually the risk profile has either 2 or 3 things. So the first one is the risk need, or the need for risk. Second one is the ability or capacity for risk. And the third one is the appetite or risk tolerance. Let's look at each of these in a little bit more detail. So the first is risk need. This is the needed or required rate of return that you need to be able to achieve your goals. So this is basically a calculation between where you are and where you want to go. That's why some people don't include this in the risk profile anymore, because that's what the financial planning modeling process is supposed to achieve. So let's put that to one side. Now you're left with 2 things: the risk ability or the risk capacity, and the risk tolerance or risk appetite. Let's look at the ability or capacity. Now, that is basically a function of what you can take. So the advisor needs to understand where you are and what your constraints are. Constraints are things like your time horizon, as well as your need for liquidity. So if you are worth something today and you want to get to your goals, but along the way, what all things that you might need your portfolio or your corpus for. So time horizon and liquidity are big constraints, and obviously any sort of liabilities that you have in between. And now we come to risk tolerance or risk appetite. Now this is meant to be a psychological profile or a trait. And like other personality traits, it's meant to be stable over time. It's meant to be inherent in us and stable over time. Having said that, risk tolerance sometimes not only includes the willingness to take risks, but also our perception of risk. So while our willingness to take risk may be stable over time, our perception of risk, especially when market conditions are going up and down, may change. So actually, even risk tolerance can change because our perceptions can change. The tools that are used to measure risk tolerance are meant to be psychometric. Psychometric means psychological or psychology and statistics. But Day to day, you are likely to come across tools that are trying to measure way too many things, not just the willingness, but the risk perception, but also sometimes the risk capacity. There is another aspect of risk tolerance that is worth pointing out, and that is our short-term behavioral biases. So these are basically mistakes we make. These could be cognitive errors or biases, which is basically the way we think is wrong, and when pointed out, we can correct them. And then there are emotional biases. These, even if you point them out to us, chances are we will still stick to our guns and do those mistakes anyway. So these cognitive and emotional biases are usually short-term and do need to be measured and monitored, and therefore it's good to have an advisor or coach that actually sort of holds the mirror to us and points these out. But it should be mentioned that these are not part of risk tolerance. So tolerance is meant to be a trait, whereas these are more short-term behaviors. We will discuss these errors in a different future episode. A commonly asked question is whether risk profiles vary across gender, so men versus women, and also across financial knowledge and across cultural differences. So there are some studies that show that women are more risk averse or less risk tolerant. And this is where it's interesting. It's not that their psychological or the willingness to take risks was different, but actually their perception of risk was different. They tend not to be as overconfident as men. So actually, if you equalize for that, their risk tolerance or the willingness to take risk was actually pretty similar. Similarly, there were some differences across cultural and other aspects. So similarly, if you come across studies like that across gender or cultural divide, it is worthwhile looking deeper into why those differences exist. So in summary, risk profile is made up of three things: the need to take risk or the required rate of return, which sometimes is excluded; the risk capacity or the ability to take risk, which has constraints like the time horizon and liquidity requirements; and the third one is risk tolerance or risk appetite, which is meant to be a psychological trait, but also sometimes has our perception of risks. Now let's talk about how risk profiling is actually done in the industry. So there are two extremes. One extreme is where they just like having a chat. They don't think they need any tool, any measurement. They simply have a chat with you. The other extreme is those who give you this psychometric profiler that measures your risk tolerance, which is fine, especially if they've used a global tool. But remember, the tolerance is only one aspect of risk profile. And then most of the industry falls somewhere in between these two extremes. These people will give you a questionnaire between 5 and 10 questions and attempt to probably measure all three aspects. So here's what I think of these risk profiling questionnaires. Some of them, as I said, try to do too many things in one go and achieve nothing. Some are just badly worded. Some assume that we know how we're going to react when the market falls by 30%. Frankly, I have no idea what I'm going to eat next week, so let alone market reactions. So there are some assumptions built in that I don't think are valid. And then finally, the output of all of these questionnaires is usually a label from very conservative to very aggressive. And instead of telling you that, they map it directly to some asset allocation and tell you that that's what you need. The problem with that is that that scale depends on what that firm is offering. So for example, for some firms, the most aggressive is 100% equities. For other firms, equities is just the midpoint and they think derivative trading is the most aggressive. So your scale is not consistent. So risk profiling questionnaires are a little bit problematic and you need to be mindful about what you're trying to do. In the meantime, if you are an investor who's been given one of these questionnaires, or if you are a budding practitioner who is using one of these questionnaires, it is worthwhile just stopping and understanding what this questionnaire is trying to do. So firstly, what aspect of risk profile is this questionnaire trying to cover? Is it the capacity? Is it the tolerance? Is it the need? What is it? Which questions are leading to which aspect? Secondly, it's worthwhile asking if this tool is based on some globally tested and well-run sort of questionnaire, and if those results that they have seen are also valid for your gender and your socioeconomic and cultural segment. Having said that, it is worthwhile spending time on understanding your own risk profile. So pulling it all together and relating it to the financial planning process, we start with our own financial circumstances, our assets, liabilities, and so on, and dependents, and then we add to it goals. And remember, in goals, we define them as needs, wants, desires. So based on these two things, your advisor is able to help you calculate your need to take risk or risk need, and also your capacity to take risk, which is also a function of your time horizon and your liquidity requirements. Then comes your willingness to take risk or risk tolerance, which in turn is made up of personality traits, which usually stays stable over time, and also your risk perception, how you perceive how market risks have changed. Then there's also your emotional or cognitive reactions to those market changes. So that's the risk perception. So these are the components of what make up your risk profile. So in summary, today we discussed risk profiling. We discussed what it is, which is basically risk need, risk capacity, and risk tolerance. We discussed that risk capacity is made up of constraints like liquidity and time horizons, while risk tolerance is a psychological trait, but it does include also changing risk perceptions. We also discussed that those changing perceptions would lead us to different behaviors and to some errors in judgment, whether it's cognitive errors or emotional errors, so the way we think or the way we feel. Speaking of that, do keep a lookout for a future episode on these behavioral biases. We also discussed risk profiling processes, the fact that some questionnaires are trying to do too much with those questions, and some people just prefer discussing. While the industry is sorting out the issues with this risk profiling processes, I would encourage you to just be mindful about yourself. Notice how you react to market conditions, market up and down, how when you see portfolio changes, how that makes you feel, and what you do about it. Just be mindful. After all, we're learning to be money mindful in this series. Catch you next time.